Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss war between Israel and Gaza, the gag order on Donald Trump, and a deal that seems to have emerged between the United Auto Workers and Ford. I'm joined by Saurabh Amari, Nina Power, and Jeff Schulenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Here at Compact, we've had a lot of coverage of the attack by Hamas on Israel and on Israel's response. It's been slower, I think, than a lot of people anticipated. Israel hasn't yet got into Gaza with heavy ground troops, and the Wall Street Journal reported this week that Israel has delayed its action at the request of U.S. authorities. The U.S. has urged caution on Israel as the U.S. brings more troops into the region and works to secure its own bases, volatile places, Syria and Iraq. Saurabh, you're following the story closely. Saurabh, you're following the situation closely. What do you think we can expect to see in the coming days?
Well, on the one hand, some outlets reporting that the Israelis have begun a limited ground operation in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. They've gone in, done operational things and then pulled out. So it's not like the full-on mass invasion yet. So that's a kind of caveat to the general line, which is that the delay is that there's minor activity at least going on, but it's more sort of itinerant coming in and out. I think the big story here, from my point of view, is the Biden administration's very difficult path they're attempting to tread, which is to allow Israel the space it needs to dismantle Hamas, which is a very, very difficult thing to do in one of the most densely populated, in fact, the most densely populated 20-mile by 9-mile rectangle in the world. To try to do that with a terrorist group that embeds in tunnels, in civilian infrastructure, in mosques and churches and so on. And at the same time, to try to prevent, which I think is an important American goal, to try to deter other powers in the region, namely Iran and its proxies, from opening up a second front to the north, and then thereby dragging potentially the United States into a confrontation directly with Iran and with Lebanon. When we say Lebanon, of course, we just mean Hezbollah, because Lebanon is not a real state. It's a sort of captive state at the mercy of Hezbollah. I think the delay right now it's been reported that it's just to make sure that the U.S. is able to reinforce its assets in the region. The U.S. has about 2,500 troops in Iraq, obviously has forces stationed elsewhere, some number in northern Syria, etc. And all of those are all vulnerable to both Iran directly and its various militias, the Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and other forces of the kind. So there's a kind of preparation that these troops and other assets are able to defend themselves in case there are like Iranian drone swarms and so on. I think it just shows you what a dangerous moment we're in and what the Biden administration is trying to do, which I think is the best they can do. And it's very wise. And, knock on wood, as of us recording this on the morning of Thursday, October 26th, it's working, which is to say, let this fight be between these two entities, Israel and Hamas, to say to everyone else, largely, stay out. Because if others don't stay out, then we're looking at a very catastrophic scenario. And so that's, I think, what I want to say President Biden, but the person that comes to mind who's like really running things to my mind probably is Jake Sullivan. I think that's what Jake Sullivan is trying to do. That's our national security advisor, by the way.
Also reports this week in the Wall Street Journal that fighters from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad trained in Iran in September. The U.S. government says that it does not have direct evidence of Iran's involvement in the Hamas attack on Israel. But nonetheless, we have reports like this citing unnamed intelligence sources that are drawing a pretty close connection between Iran and the attack. How does that change the complexion of things?
Well, one factor worth noting here is that you do have a contingent in D.C. of extreme Iran hawks who have been chomping at the bit to engage in all-out war with Iran for decades. And once again, we have seen some of this, clear kind of bizarre kind of lust for what would surely be a catastrophic conflict reemerge particularly in some corners of the Republican Party. And this is quite disturbing. The potential for a war that would essentially pit Iran with some degree of backing from China and Russia against the U.S. and its regional allies is really a very disturbing prospect. Saurabh wrote something related to this for the American Conservative, so he might want to discuss that piece. But, more broadly, it is interesting. There was a long profile of Sullivan that came out in the New Yorker, of Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, that came out in the New Yorker prior to the most recent events. And Sullivan has actually been criticized in the past few days because he wrote a piece for Foreign Policy that went to print, just before the Hamas attack, and, took credit for the administration's Middle East policy having kind of stabilized things, which looks like has aged very poorly. And then, the Foreign Policy website actually kind of removed some of these statements, which is probably not very good either. But in any case, what you do see in this profile of Sullivan, which, is mostly focused on how he and Biden have seen their role during the Ukraine war, is Biden being a very cautious figure in terms of how he approaches these kinds of conflicts. And, Sullivan, in a sense, I think, taking a kind of mediating role. Certainly in terms of Ukraine, it seems clear that, despite the sort of quite disturbing and, that there's a slightly different, although somewhat overlapping set of hawks who have clearly kind of been fantasizing about some sort of all-out war with Russia since early 2022. It does seem like, we have in figures like Sullivan and Biden himself a more realistic contingent of people who are actually wielding power, which is at least somewhat encouraging. Unlike, let's say, during we published a column kind of comparing this moment to the moment prior to the Iraq War, when, as disastrous as it turned out to be, the U.S. was certainly sort of better prepared for that situation, even though it didn't prevent there from being a debacle. But, it's clear that Sullivan and his cohort within the Biden administration are of a very different mindset than the kind of hawkish sort of idealists who really believed that they could, kind of bomb the Middle East into democracy 20 years ago. So they do seem to be, basically pretty moderate and cautious and realistic people at the helm here, which I suppose, even though I'm extremely, concerned about the potential for Iran being drawn into this conflict, and extremely disturbed to see the reemergence of these complete lunatics who actually seem to want that to happen. It does seem like the people who are actually driving policy are far more judicious, and that's at least somewhat encouraging. Saurabh, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the Iran hawk contingent. Glorious reemergence.
They've always been there, and of course they have an opening, right? You can't deny the fact that that Hamas is supported by Iran, and it's very difficult to imagine that Hamas undertook this on a freelance basis, given how dependent it is on Iran, and that the Iranian regime, something on this scale of sophistication, it's very hard to imagine that the reporting in places like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal are all wrong when they say that Iran had some significant planning role in this, or some role or some degree of involvement, whatever. It varies by story, and it varies by outlet, and in terms of timing. The Washington Post dated it differently than the beginning of Iran's involvement, differently than the New York Times did, and so on. It's not that the Iranian regime isn't nasty, and obviously as an Iranian American, I lament the fact that Iran devotes so much national energy to trying to make Israelis insecure, as opposed to other things like building up Iran so that it's a better country for Iranians. There's no denying that it's a very destructive force in the Middle East, and especially tragic given the fact that all these Arab countries were making peace with Israel. That's a positive development. And yes, it's mostly government to government, but that can sometimes translate gradually into popular acceptance of the Jewish state as an element, a fixture in the regime that isn't going to be erased. So Iran trying to disrupt that process is also very ugly and destructive. But the question Americans have to ask is, what are Americans priorities globally and whether it's possible for the United States to basically try to wage a three-front war against two regional powers, arguably Russia and Iran, and then something that could be described as a superpower, namely China. And so it's a matter of just wise priorities and the sort of dangers involved in the kind of fantasies you hear from figures like, let's say, Nikki Haley, who talks about changing the Department of Defense's name to the Department of Offense. She said that last week, meaning that America would specifically be on the offense against those three governments, two of which are nuclear powers. So it's not that Iran isn't nasty or that it shouldn't somehow be punished once we're certain about its involvement in this attack. I think it's pretty likely, very, very likely that it was involved in this attack. But whether or not escalating all the way to one more regional war, and Russia as well, but also rattling the saber over Taiwan, it's like I like our columnist Malcolm Cuney and others who write for Compact, I just don't think the U.S. can simultaneously fight three wars against, like I said, one superpower and two regional powers, or arguably two great powers and one regional power, depending on what you consider Iran and Russia. So that's the issue, and that the kind of language you hear from the Lindsey Graham, Nikki Haley types is really scary, and it seems to me really irresponsible. Whereas, like you said, I think the Biden administration, given everything, the totality of circumstances, is acting more judicious. And I think the one thing to note is that we've leveled a lot of criticism at the student left or the DSA left for either poo-pooing Hamas's atrocities or outright celebrating them. They are despicable, but there's no denying that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party at large has iced these people out the way, in some ways, the bipartisan establishment in Britain did with the Corbynites, whether that was fair or not. These people are even more estranged from power. By these people, I mean the sort of campus Hamasniks. And may stay that way forever. But Lindsey Graham is in the Senate and Nikki Haley wants to be president. Those are two, we should be equally appalled, not equally, but at least somewhat appalled by the fact that these people are sort of salivating for World War III.
I'm just going to mention, Republican presidential politics have kind of gone on the back burner. We'll be talking about Trump in a minute, but I read recently Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, charts the sort of counterfactual history in which Charles Lindbergh is elected president on a kind of isolationist platform in 1940 on a promise to keep America out of foreign entanglements, and comes to a kind of pact with Hitler, right? And obviously a lot of it is kind of focused on the situation of Jews in America and domestic politics in this context. But it is interesting as we see this kind of seeming escalation into war on the global stage that you can imagine, and certainly Trump's promises with regard to Ukraine have been largely along these lines, right? That he's promised that he would restore peace, and seek some kind of truce, an end to the war. And you wonder what the potency of a Trump campaign that promised something like that, right? Which in the Roth book is kind of quite sinister. And part of the problem that you see with that is, on one hand, it's hard to imagine, from any Republican candidate or mainstream candidate at all, a similar desire to disengage from the U.S. commitment to Israel's security. And this, of course, partly ties into themes that are addressed in Roth's novel, in terms of what the U.S.'s sort of responsibility and previous failures were with regard to the Holocaust, right? But at the same time, it's bizarre that you could imagine a Trump sort of peacenik campaign, right? That would promise, being able to make deals with China, Russia, Iran, etc. Although Trump, in fact, scrapped the Iran deal, but you can imagine something roughly along those lines. But then, what's bizarre is that you also have him in the party with someone like Lindsey Graham, who became closely allied with Trump, who's, one of the most deranged advocates of kind of basically full escalation to World War III. So, the contradictions within the party just seem like they inevitably on foreign policy are inevitably going to come to the fore at some point, as, these various conflicts heat up across the world. So I think that's another thing, even though it's a bit on the back burner at the moment. It'll be very strange and interesting to see how this unfolds.
In the domestic sphere, of course, the big question, one of many in the campaign, is, Trump's legal woes. A gag order was imposed on Trump connected with, his indictment. He appealed it, and the district court judge overseeing his federal criminal case regarding the 2020 election paused the gag order. Now, Jack Smith, the prosecutor in the case, has requested that it be reimposed. He has cited statements Trump has made since the pausing of the gag order to argue for its reimposition. When you have a prosecution going on of the leading candidates for the presidency from one party, according to many polls, actually, the favored candidate over Joe Biden, it becomes difficult or impossible to separate the legal and the political. To suppose that this is just a narrow legal proceeding and not a political effort to kneecap one of the candidates, it's a nice thought. It's something that I'm sure is important to at least some actors who support Trump's prosecution. But it's going to be very, very hard to maintain that firewall. And we've seen that in this controversy still very much ongoing over Trump's speech, really about the speech of a political candidate. If he can't call this prosecution a witch hunt, if he can't denounce the people involved in it, to what extent does that, curtail his ability to campaign? And but there are considerations on the other side. There are just extraordinary aspects of this case.
I mean, maybe just a kind of aesthetic observation, which is to do with the kind of performative aspect of politics and diplomacy. I mean, it's interesting in relation to the ongoing wars in America. I mean, Trump is far more a businessman than he is a hawk, and in a way he might have, Biden is urging caution, and there are some diplomatic options, hopefully, before the entire world descends into World War III. But it's interesting that we're still dealing with these kind of paradoxes of speech and the way people speak and the aesthetic presentation of politics. So regardless of the actual outcome of how Trump might be in terms of being diplomatic and trying to promote business, it's the way he does things that's offensive. And this tension is also there in the kind of ultra left or left liberal response to language in general, like words of violence, but actual violence is fine, is freedom. And I don't know, it's just a more theoretical observation about, I guess, the absurdities of the relationship between speech and action, which are kind of manifest in the treatment of Trump, but also in I don't even know whether it's hypocrisy. It's not exactly hypocrisy. It's a kind of being able to hold two absolutely contradictory ideas in one's head at the same time, which seems to be the way many people are understanding violence in Gaza from Israel by Hamas, also in Ukraine, and the role of Azov and actual Nazis in Ukraine. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to put these things back together again and sort of have a more, a properly mediated and nuanced understanding of the relationship between words and violence, which I suppose, after all, is what diplomacy is. And it's interesting that compared to the Iraq war, we don't have the language of diplomacy and democracy, really, which was the key word in 2003 and around that time. The idea Jeff mentioned of exporting democracy, this great empire project. I mean, of course, this also involved, stealing all the resources of the countries that America was supposed to be exporting democracy to. But we don't even have this cover story anymore. Democracy has disappeared, and it's, maybe being replaced by this language of the oppressed and the oppressor. Jeff analysed this sort of Fanonian, the mainstreaming of a kind of Fanonian decolonial idea. Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be great to have a pause for everyone to come together and talk about what speech is, what diplomacy is, and what violence actually is, because things are looking very bad for many places, and America is in no position to deal with them, I would say.
Yeah, on the Trump indictment, I really, and just the kind of ongoing legal effort against him, if one's goal is to defend democracy, I wonder how effective this is. It seems to me perfectly engineered to diminish the faith of the American right in the American electoral process. If, say, Trump loses a narrow race, and, recent presidential contests just as a rule have been narrow. So, for the sake of just, faith in our system and the credibility of that system, liberals have taken in kind of weaponizing the justice system against Trump. Really, really disturbing. And what many people have pointed out, I think, these are familiar points, but ones that make a certain intuitive sense to a lot of Americans, in terms of the handling of classified documents, lots of unkosher things that have happened, not just with former presidents, but with other former high-ranking officials. Other elements of the Trump case admit of various interpretations, and I think aren't slam dunks, even the strongest parts of the case against him. So, just have kind of worries here. I think probably for a lot of listeners, maybe even a few people on the podcast, and I mean, it's true of me. It's hard to follow all the ins and outs of this. So you just kind of know, okay, there are all these legal cases against Trump. What's happening here? Who knows? Did Trump do some things that he shouldn't have? Yeah, probably. Is it being blown out of proportion? Yeah, probably also. I don't know how much people are closely following. I don't know how closely people are following this, but even as they tune out, I think there's something pretty worrying in this process. Other news, how the economy is doing, pretty important. The running smoothly is going to be very decisive in 2024. And I think that's one reason why you saw the Biden administration paying a great deal of attention to the United Auto Workers strike at Ford, GM, and Stellantis facilities. And now it seems that an agreement has emerged between Ford and the United Auto Workers. This agreement could perhaps extend to other auto workers. It's not, the ink isn't dry yet. I don't think the ink's even on the page, but there's at least an agreement in principle to a 25% pay raise over the course of several years for Ford workers. The United Auto Workers requested a 40% raise initially. Ford offered them a single-digit raise. Also, people who aren't locked into the UAW's favorable pay schedule are going to be able to get on that schedule more quickly. And the United Auto Workers will have kind of specified rights to strike in the future. It looks like a very good deal. It looks like a real win for Sean Fain. It's not yet clear what role the Biden administration may have played in this deal, but certainly Biden, who went and appeared on a picket line, was paying close attention to this. And one question I have, interested if any of you have any speculations on this point, is whether Trump's overtures to auto workers played any role in this. The Biden administration did feel pressure to go appear on the picket line, in part because Trump first announced that he was going to give a speech to auto workers. He kind of managed to turn up the temperature on Biden. There's certainly great anxiety about whether the Rust Belt, the upper Midwest, will go for Biden or go for Trump. And I wonder if Trump's overtures to the auto workers maybe inspired more action on the part of the Biden administration. And basically, if there was a bit of a bidding war in the background that may have helped the auto workers get a better deal than they otherwise would have. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. The political dance between Trump and Biden is at least interesting.
Yeah, well, this is what you want. You want both parties to compete for labor's favor. That's what you had. Not only Biden, but we should note they're both friends of Compact. J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley showed up. Trump's appearance was awkward because at one point he went to a non-union shop. But the overall point is that, there's a message that this sends to the wider economy that collective bargaining works, collective action works. It works really well when labor, as we've argued in our pages, numerous contributors. It works best when labor is an independent force between the two parties rather than being totally beholden to one. So I think the fact that the two Republicans, populist Republicans and Democrats, were competing for the union, for the UAW's good favors and to competing for their bestowal of the recognition that you're a person who has solidarity with the working class, that's a good dynamic. I mean, I wish we would have more of it. There's complicated issues like the role of Biden's push for electric vehicles and how that threatens lots of jobs that are connected to the carbon industry. On the other hand, and also the fact that, I mean, this is an issue we definitely hear from the labor movement, which is that a lot of EV production right now is geared toward, quote unquote, right to work states or states that are very hostile to unions. Will that change? And then on the Republican side, it's not like they're perfect either. Everyone knows that the same Trump, who sounded these supportive notes, if elected, will likely have a Department of Labor staffed by union busters. So neither political side is perfect, but the underlying dynamic of having politicians of both parties try to appear as pro-labor is definitely, it's new. I mean, I don't, Matthew, you know better, but I can't think of prior strikes at all where Republican senators showed up or anything like that. Maybe you can correct me.
Not that I know. So I'll defer to more learned labor historians than I, but not in my political memory.
I believe George W. Bush was able to secure some labor support because of essentially what Michael Lind described for us in the piece he wrote on this topic. Basically advocating policies that would sort of support the industries in which a given set of steel workers, for example, operated. I believe the memory is hazy, but I believe Bush kind of imposed some tariffs that helped the steel industry, and so he did get support from steel workers and things like that. So in other words, not directly by trying to court striking workers, but instead by you've had Republicans previously who would essentially who would propose policies that would preserve jobs in a given industry, unionized industry, and thereby capture some of the union vote. So, but the issue with that is it was in a context of declining share of union voters. It didn't alter the basic dynamics. So it does seem like a courtship between the two parties in which both are attempting to capture labor votes, and including appealing to striking workers would have some possibility of reversing the overall trend towards a sort of weakening of labor. It is an interesting development, no question.
With that, thanks, Saurabh, Jeff, Nina. Thanks to listeners. compactmag.com/subscribe. Just $9 a month. You can get all our contents, even better deal. Get a full year. Go there, check it out.